9:17 a.m. over the Pacific. American bombers open their bay doors at 20,000 feet. 40 seconds later, nothing. Japanese destroyers simply turn and sail on. Precision bombing has failed. So one general asks a forbidden question: what if we put a tank cannon on an airplane? At 9:17 a.m., the bomb bay doors closed and the American crews leaned forward in their seats, counting the seconds. 40 of them. That's how long a bomb takes to fall from 20,000 feet. 40 seconds of hope. 40 seconds of belief in math manuals, in the promise of modern air power. Below them, Japanese destroyers cut through the Solomon Sea in perfect formation, gray steel, slicing blue water. The Norden bomb sites said, "This should work." The calculations were flawless. Wind drift corrected. Release levers pulled. Then the ocean erupted not in fire, but in harmless white plumes. Every bomb missed, not by inches, but by hundreds of yards. The destroyers didn't scatter. They didn't panic. Their captains simply watched, ordered a calm turn, and sailed on untouched. It happened again and again, day after day. Millions of dollars in bombs, fuel, and aircraft splashed uselessly into the Pacific, while the Tokyo Express ran supplies straight to the front lines. The future of warfare the Army had promised was precision bombing. Out here, that future was a lie. The truth was brutal, and it had nothing to do with courage or skill. It was physics. A bomb dropped from high altitude takes nearly a full minute to reach the sea. In that minute, a destroyer moving at 30 knots can change its position by half a mile. Japanese captains knew this. They watched the American bombers climb, saw the bay doors open, and simply waited. When the bombs fell, they turned, clean, effortless, almost bored. What was supposed to be impossible was happening every day. The U.S. Army Air Forces had built an entire doctrine on the idea that altitude meant safety and accuracy. But over the Southwest Pacific, that doctrine was bleeding out. Crews flew home exhausted and empty-handed. Maintenance teams scavenged wrecks for spare parts. Morale sank with every missed attack. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers ran the slot like it belonged to them, unloading men guns and ammunition without a scratch on their hulls. This was the nightmare waiting on the desk of a new commander when he arrived in theater. Major General George Kenney didn't look like a man who worshipped manuals. He was short, blunt, and aggressive, more shop foreman than polished general. When he read the reports of high-altitude raids, he didn't debate them. He threw them away. Kenney understood the problem instantly. Trying to hit a warship from 20,000 feet was like dropping a marble from a skyscraper into a coffee cup being dragged by a sprinting cat. The enemy wasn't brave. They were just faster than gravity. If air power was going to matter in this war, it couldn't stay in the clouds. It had to go down into the spray, into the flak, right in front of the guns. And once Kenney reached that conclusion, the war in the Pacific was about to take a very dangerous turn. Getting lower was easy to say. Surviving it was another matter. At mast height, machine guns were useless. Rifle caliber rounds skipped off destroyer hulls like gravel off armor. Kenney didn't need noise, he needed shock. He needed something that could tear into a boiler room, smash a bridge, and stop a ship now. That's when his eyes landed on the impossible. Sitting on airfield hardstands and in dusty depots was the Army's 75mm field gun, a brute born in World War I designed to crack bunkers and punch through tanks. It fired a 15-pound shell with enough force to wreck concrete and steel. On land, it was bolted to the earth. In tanks, 30 tons of armor absorbed its kick. In an airplane, it had no business being there. Kenney didn't care. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell, a tough, overbuilt medium bomber, and saw not a bomber, but a delivery system. The idea was pure madness: rip off the glass nose, shove a tank cannon into the front of a twin-engine aircraft, and fly it straight at a warship. The weight alone was a nightmare. The recoil was worse. When engineers ran the numbers, the results screamed red. They warned the blast would shear rivets, shatter cockpit glass, stall the aircraft, maybe tear the nose clean off. They called it a flying coffin. Kenney called it necessary. While engineers talked stress limits, Japanese destroyers were unloading troops. While slide rules argued physics, men were dying in the jungle. Kenney wasn't asking permission, he was issuing a verdict. The manuals went into the trash. He ordered the nose rebuilt in steel, the cockpit rearranged, and a man added whose sole job was to hand-load artillery shells in midair. It was a bet against physics, against doctrine, against common sense. And everyone involved knew that when the trigger was finally pulled, the airplane or the war was going to break first. The engineers didn't argue anymore. They warned, they documented, they predicted disaster in clean-typed pages filled with words like catastrophic failure and structural collapse. Then they were overruled. Orders came down, and the impossible became mandatory. A prototype would be built, not because anyone believed in it, but because the war demanded it. On factory floors and in sweltering Pacific hangars, the B-25 was mutilated. The elegant glass nose, once home to the bombardier, and his precision optics, was sawed off like a limb. In its place went blunt steel, bolted and welded with brute force. Inside that steel snout, crews cradled the massive 75mm cannon. It was so large, the pilot could almost touch the breech from his seat. There was no automation, no elegance, just metal hydraulics and violence waiting to be unleashed. The aircraft's balance was ruined instantly. The nose sagged toward the ground like a wounded animal. To fix it, mechanics didn't consult aerodynamic charts. They bolted raw lead into the tail until the plane sat level again. It was ugly, heavy, wrong by every rule of flight. Test pilots reported it handled like a dump truck with wings. The sleek bomber was gone. What remained was something else entirely, a flying battering ram. Inside the cockpit, the changes were just as severe. The navigator station was ripped out. The bombardier was gone. In their place stood a new crewman with the most terrifying job in the Air Forces, the cannon loader. He would stand inches from the gun wrestle, 15-pound shells in turbulence, slam them home by hand, and brace for recoil that felt like a car crash. One mistake meant death. Rumors spread fast. Pilots joked the plane would fly backward when it fired. They called it the flying artillery. Beneath the laughter was fear. No one knew what would happen when that trigger was pulled for the first time. Would the wing stay on? Would the engine stall? Or would the aircraft simply disintegrate? In midair, there was no more room for theory. The next step wasn't a meeting, it was a takeoff. And once that cannon fired, there would be no walking the idea back. The test flight was a confession booth for everyone involved. There would be no excuses once the wheels left the runway. The modified B-25 lumbered forward engines, straining using nearly every foot of asphalt before clawing its way into the humid air. It climbed slowly, painfully, like it didn't want to fly at all. Every vibration felt wrong. Every groan of metal sounded like a warning. The target was a lonely coral reef off the coast, chosen because no one would die if the airplane tore itself apart. Inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. Sweat ran down backs despite the slipstream. The new crewman in the nose. The cannon loader gripped a 15-pound shell like a weightlifter before a deadlift. No powered rammer, no safety net, just muscle and timing. He shoved the round into the breech, slammed it shut, and shouted over the engines, "Gun ready." The pilot lined up the nose using a crude iron sight bolted to the dashboard. No bomb sight, no computer, just instinct. He steadied his hands and squeezed the trigger. The airplane didn't just fire, it stopped. For a split second, forward motion felt arrested, as if the B-25 had slammed into an invisible wall. The recoil hammered through the airframe with the violence of a collision. Rivets screamed. The cockpit filled with choking white smoke and the sharp bite of burned propellant. Teeth rattled. Vision vanished. Then the smoke cleared. The wings were still there. The engines were still turning. The control column still answered. And below them, the reef exploded water and pulverized coral, erupting exactly where the nose had been pointed. Physics hadn't won. Fear hadn't won. The airplane had survived. On the ground, mechanics and engineers stared in stunned silence. The math had said this couldn't work. The reports had promised disaster. But the evidence was hanging in the air, still flying. The impossible had just become real. That single shot changed everything. It proved that a bomber could carry artillery, that recoil could be tamed, that doctrine could be broken. The question was no longer, can it fire? Now there was a far more dangerous one waiting to be answered. What happens when that cannon is aimed at a living firing warship that intends to kill you first? Proving it could fire was the easy part. Learning how to fight with it was something else entirely. Overnight, the rules of bombing were thrown out. A bomber was meant to be steady, predictable, a flying platform for falling explosives. This machine demanded the opposite. The cannon was fixed forward. It didn't swivel. It didn't forgive. To aim it, the pilot had to aim the entire airplane. That meant diving straight at the target. No weaving, no last-second jink, just a long, terrifying approach run directly into enemy guns. The pilots called it bore sighting, but it felt more like a game of chicken played at 200 miles an hour. On paper, the 75mm could reach out thousands of yards. In reality, no one trusted it beyond 1,000. To guarantee a hit, they had to get close enough to see details, railings, gun shields, faces. Training was relentless. Crews attacked old wrecks and abandoned hulks, learning the brutal rhythm of the run. Dive, steady, fire. Absorb the recoil. Recover, reload, fire again. If the loader was fast and didn't black out from G-forces, maybe 3 rounds per pass. This wasn't a machine gun. It was a sniper rifle with wings. Miss, and you had to circle back, exposing your belly to every gun on the ship. Inside the cockpit, teamwork became survival. The pilot flew and aimed. The co-pilot managed engines and called range. The loader worked like a piston shell. Up, breech, open, slam, lock, brace, load, fire, load, fire. Brass casings piled up on the floor, rolling underfoot with every maneuver. Hands blistered, muscles screamed. Fear was constant. The first real targets weren't destroyers. They were barges, small supply boats creeping along coastlines at dawn. and the results were immediate and shocking. Bombs often punched clean holes straight through wood without detonating. The 75mm didn't punch holes. It erased ships. One hit turned a barge into splinters, fuel, and fire. Crews came home wide-eyed, silent, realizing what they'd just unleashed. The joke stopped. The skepticism vanished. The so-called suicide box had teeth. And as names were painted on steel noses and more guns were bolted into place, everyone understood the truth. This weapon wasn't a gimmick, it was a hunter, and soon it would be pointed at something that could shoot back. The real test arrived with the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers, fast, disciplined, and arrogant, were still running troops and supplies down the slot, like nothing could touch them. These were not barges. A destroyer was 300 feet of hardened steel wrapped in flak guns and crewed by men who had spent months shooting airplanes out of the sky. To them, a medium bomber at low altitude was a gift. Big, slow, dead. Late in 1942, Japanese command assembled a major convoy to reinforce New Guinea. Fast transports, veteran escorts, confidence bordering on contempt. They believed speed would save them and altitude would protect them. They didn't know the rules had changed. At dawn, under low clouds hugging the water, the modified B-25s rolled down the runway heavy with fuel and artillery shells. Radios were quiet. Jokes were gone. Every crew knew what waited ahead. If the engineers had been right, one solid hit from a destroyer's main gun would turn their airplane into confetti. If Kenney had been right, they were about to hunt warships. When the clouds broke, the convoy appeared gray hulls cutting white wakes through dark water. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Black flak burst in the sky. Standard procedure followed: turn broadside, bring every gun to bear. But the bombers didn't climb. They didn't open bomb bays. They shoved the yokes forward and dropped down to 50 feet above the waves, props kicking up, spray engines screaming. From the bridge of the lead destroyer, the approach looked familiar. Low aircraft meant torpedoes. The captain ordered the ship to turn into the attack, narrowing the target. It was textbook defense. Then confusion set in. The American plane didn't release anything. It didn't pull up. It didn't dodge. It came straight on, nose down, charging head-on like it wanted to collide. Tracers reached out, cracking past the cockpit. The air filled with smoke and steel. Inside the B-25, the world collapsed to a ring sight and white knuckles on the controls. The pilot couldn't flinch. To aim the cannon, he had to hold steady. He was the guidance system. Machine guns opened first, a brutal curtain of fire that swept the bow and bridge, smashing glass and forcing gunners down. The flak faltered. That was the opening. At close range, dangerously close, the loader tapped the pilot's shoulder. The shell was live. The pilot made a final micro-adjustment and squeezed the trigger. The airplane slammed back against its own momentum. Smoke filled the cockpit. And then the shell hit, punching through steel, detonating deep inside the ship. The destroyer lurched, wounded and burning. For the first time in the Pacific, a warship had been cracked open by an airplane firing artillery. And everyone in the sky knew there was no going back now. The first hit didn't kill the destroyer, but it broke the spell. Smoke poured from the bow, black and angry, and the ship's perfect white wake faltered. Whatever the shell had found inside boiler steam line, electrical trunk, it had bitten deep. The predator was bleeding. And in war, that's all it takes. The B-25 screamed overhead so low, the rear gunner could see sailors scattering on the deck below. As the pilot hauled the aircraft into a hard turn, gravity doubled inside the fuselage. This was the most dangerous moment. The cannon loader fought the G-force's boots slipping on the vibrating metal floor as he dragged another 15-pound shell from the rack. Muscles burned. Vision narrowed. He slammed the round into the breech, locked it, and screamed into the intercom. The gun was ready again. The pilot rolled back toward the target. The destroyer wasn't maneuvering anymore. It was limping, listing slightly fire-licking from twisted steel. Anti-aircraft fire resumed, but it was wild now. Fear had replaced discipline. The hunters had become something else in the sailors' minds. This wasn't an airplane anymore. It was a charging animal. The second run was deliberate. The pilot aimed for the stern where speed lived. Once again, machine guns raked the deck, pinning crews behind shields. Once again, the cannon fired. The recoil shook the airframe like a fist. The shell struck near the depth charge racks, and the world detonated. A secondary explosion tore the aft section open in a rolling fireball. Debris arced into the air. The water itself rippled outward in a dark, expanding ring. When the smoke cleared, the destroyer's wake was gone. The screws had stopped. The ship lay crippled, dead in the water. That was the signal. The rest of the squadron dropped in, switching weapons. Bombs skipped across the sea like flat stones, slamming into the hull and detonating against steel. The destroyer groaned as plates buckled and water rushed in. A warship that had ruled these waters for a year was beaten to death in minutes, not by a battleship, not by a submarine, but by modified bombers flying at wave-top height. As the B-25s pulled away, radio. Chatter erupted, shouts, laughter, disbelief. Adrenaline spilled out with the words. But beneath it was something heavier, a realization settling in. The equation of naval warfare had just been shattered. Speed was no longer enough. Flak was no longer a shield. If an airplane could carry a tank gun and survive long enough to use it, then the ocean had become a killing ground. And the Japanese Navy had just learned that lesson the hard way. When the B-25s turned for home, they didn't look like victors. They looked battered, scorched, barely held together. Soot streaked the steel noses. Paint blistered from muzzle blasts. Inside the cockpits, hot brass casings rolled across the floor, with every bank chiming like broken glass. Hands shook. Ears rang. Flight suits were soaked through with sweat. These weren't men celebrating a clean win. They were men coming down from a near-death collision with reality. But the truth waited on the runway. As the wheels slammed onto the strip at Port Moresby and the engines wound down, something spread through the crews faster than any order, disbelief turning into certainty. They hadn't just survived. They had changed the rules. In the debriefing room, the proof flickered to life. Grainy gun camera footage showed the impossible, an airplane firing artillery shells, striking steel explosions blooming from inside a destroyer's hull. There was no arguing with it, no theory left to debate. The ship hadn't been damaged, it had been killed. General Kenney watched in silence. Then he smiled, the tight, satisfied smile of a man who had gambled his career, his pilots and the war itself, on an idea everyone else had called insane. He ordered the photos rushed stateside. He wanted every engineer who had warned him about torn wings and stalled engines to see the truth burned into film. The airplane had held. The physics had bent. And the Japanese Navy had paid the price. What followed was immediate and irreversible. Factories stopped hesitating and started building. The B-25G went into production followed by even heavier armed versions. Armor was added, guns multiplied. The Mitchell stopped pretending to be aerodynamic and embraced what it had become, a street fighter of the sky. Out on the water, the effect was just as dramatic. Japanese captains no longer steamed confidently in daylight. Convoys hugged coastlines, hid in weather, ran at night. The Tokyo Express, the symbol of untouchable speed, had lost its nerve. The hunters were being hunted now. The age of the invincible surface ship was cracking. And it wasn't cracking under elegant theory or perfect math. It was breaking under brute force, low altitude, and the sound of a cannon firing from an airplane that was never supposed to exist. The cannon's reign was violent and brief. As 1943 bled into 1944, the war accelerated and technology began to catch up with desperation. The 75mm gun had saved the campaign when nothing else worked, but it demanded perfection. Pilots needed nerves of steel. Loaders needed brute strength. One missed run meant circling back through flak. It was raw human unforgiving. Then came the rockets. High-velocity aircraft rockets, lighter, cleaner, easier. A pilot could loose a full salvo with a single squeeze, no recoil hammering the airframe. No man wrestling shells inches from an explosion. Firepower multiplied, risk dropped. The brutal elegance of the cannon gave way to efficiency. Later B-25s lost the big gun, replacing it with solid noses packed with machine guns, flying buzzsaws that shredded targets by volume instead of a single killing blow. The crews missed the monster. They missed the moment when the plane seemed to stop in midair, when you felt the shot in your bones. But wars don't reward nostalgia. They reward what works. The cannon had done its job. It bridged a gap between failure and dominance long enough for the next generation of weapons to arrive. When the war ended, the gunships faded quietly. Cannons were unbolted. Airframes scrapped or sold. Pilots went home and folded those days into silence. The story shrank into a footnote, an insane improvisation from a desperate time. But ideas don't die that easily. They wait. 20 years later, in another jungle war, the concept returned. Old transport planes circled targets, pouring fire from the sky. Then came the ultimate descendant, a massive gunship carrying cannons and howitzers, orbiting like a predator, raining precision destruction below. Every shot echoed the same defiance of physics, first proven over the Pacific. The engineers had said it couldn't be done. The manuals had called it suicide. But history isn't written by caution. It's written by people who look at impossible problems and choose violence, ingenuity, and nerve. Once a general threw a rulebook away. Once a pilot aimed an airplane like a rifle, and once a bomber became a battleship long enough to change a war. The story should have ended there, with scrap metal surplus guns and forgotten airframes. Most people assume that's how war innovations die. Used once, filed away, replaced by something cleaner, smarter, more modern. But this idea refused to stay buried, because what the B-25 gunships proved wasn't just that a cannon could fly. They proved something far more dangerous, that air power didn't need elegance to dominate. It needed persistence. The bomber with a tank gun had shattered a rule everyone thought was permanent. And once a rule is broken, it never truly comes back. Years later, new wars dragged old lessons out of dusty archives. In Southeast Asia, American forces faced a familiar problem. Enemies hidden in jungle moving at night, immune to fast jets screaming overhead. Precision alone wasn't enough. Speed wasn't enough. What was needed was presence, pressure, a weapon that could stay and keep firing. So the idea returned older, heavier, meaner. Transport planes were turned into orbiting killers. Guns mounted sideways. Crews circling targets for hours, pouring controlled destruction into the dark. The concept had matured, but its soul was unchanged. The lineage was unmistakable. Every shell fired was an echo of that first insane shot from a B-25 nose over the Pacific. Today's gunships carry weapons. General Kenney could only dream of cannons larger than his field gun, guided munitions sensors that see through night and weather. But strip away the technology and the philosophy remains brutally simple. Get close, hit hard, don't let go. The engineers once said the recoil would tear the wings off. They were wrong. The wings held. What broke instead was certainty, the belief that war must follow neat equations and perfect designs. The men who flew those early gunships proved that innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from corners, from desperation, from people willing to fly something that shouldn't exist because the alternative is losing. We tell this story because it almost vanished. Because the Green Dragons, the loaders choking on cordite, the pilots charging steel ships head-on, none of it fits the clean myth of technological progress. It was messy, dangerous, human. And because sometimes history isn't changed by the smartest solution on paper. Sometimes it's changed by the one bold enough to pull the trigger anyway. History likes clean lines, timelines, bullet points. But real change is loud, improvised, and usually smells like smoke. The flying artillery never fit neatly into doctrine, and that's exactly why it mattered. For a brief, violent moment, it solved a problem no one else could. It didn't win the war by itself, but it kept the war from being lost when the math said defeat was inevitable. The men who flew those missions didn't think of themselves as pioneers. They were just trying to survive the next run. Years later, many of them struggled to explain what it felt like to aim an entire airplane, like a rifle, to charge a steel warship head-on, knowing one lucky hit could erase them from the sky. There were no medals for inventing a new way to kill ships, just quiet memories locked away. As the decades passed, the story faded. Textbooks talked about carriers, submarines, rockets. The B-25 gunships became a footnote, an odd experiment from a desperate phase of the war. But footnotes matter. They're where the rules get broken. They're where future wars steal their best ideas. Every modern gunship owes a debt to that moment when someone ignored the manual and trusted nerve over numbers. When engineers said no and pilots said, "Watch me." When a bomber stopped being a delivery system and became a weapon in its own right. We tell this story because it reminds us that innovation isn't always clean. It doesn't always arrive with approval stamps and perfect equations. Sometimes it shows up welded together in a hot hangar, balanced with lead bars and flown by men who know it might kill them. The B-25 with a cannon wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, but it was honest. It met the enemy where they were and hit them with everything it had. And for a crucial stretch of the Pacific War, That was enough. If this story hit you, don't let it disappear again. Like the video, stay subscribed, and leave a comment, because history only survives if someone is still willing to tell it. And that's the part most people miss. This wasn't a story about a gun or even about an airplane. It was a story about a moment when the war demanded an answer, now not after another study, not after another revision. A moment when failure was bleeding men out of the jungle, and waiting was more dangerous than being wrong. The B-25 gunship existed in that narrow space between desperation and invention. It wasn't born from perfect theory. It was born from refusal, the refusal to accept that nothing could be done. The refusal to let equations decide the outcome while ships sailed freely and men died ashore. General Kenney didn't win because he was smarter than the engineers. He won because he was willing to be blamed, willing to risk ridicule, careers, and lives on an idea that looked insane on paper but made brutal sense in combat. And the crews who flew those planes weren't heroes because they were fearless. They were heroes because they climbed into cockpits knowing the plane might not forgive a single mistake and flew anyway. That mindset echoes far beyond World War II. Every time a rule is broken in warfare, every time doctrine lags behind reality, this story repeats itself in different shapes and different skies. Innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from corners, when the enemy has momentum, when options are gone, when someone decides that the old answers are no longer acceptable. The flying artillery didn't last forever. It didn't need to. Its job was to bridge a gap, to buy time to smash a door open so the next generation of weapons could walk through. And it did that job perfectly. So when we talk about World War II machines, we shouldn't just ask what they were designed to do. We should ask why they were pushed beyond their limits and who had the nerve to push them. Because history isn't shaped by flawless machines, it's shaped by flawed ones, flown by stubborn people in moments when failure is no longer an option. And if there's one final truth this story leaves behind, it's this: wars don't turn on genius alone. They turn on nerve, on people willing to look at a machine, a rule book, a neat line of math, and decide none of it matters as much as stopping the enemy right now. The B-25 with a cannon wasn't elegant history. It was loud, violent, and temporary. It existed only because the moment demanded something reckless enough to work. And once that moment passed, it faded, just like so many tools forged in crisis. But fading doesn't mean failing. Some ideas aren't meant to last forever. They're meant to hit once hard enough to change the direction of the fight. For a brief window in the Pacific surface, ships stopped being untouchable. Speed stopped being safety. Flak stopped being confidence. Somewhere between the spray of the waves and the blast of a 75mm shell, the balance shifted. The ocean got smaller, deadlier, honest. The men who made that happen didn't think in terms of legacy. They were thinking about the next approach, the next reload, the next burst of tracer fire ripping past the cockpit glass. They were thinking about getting home. History came later, written quietly long after the cordite smell had faded from their clothes. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they celebrate destruction, but because they expose how fragile certainty really is. How often impossible is just another word for untested. How progress sometimes comes not from refinement, but from collision between desperation and imagination. The flying artillery was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to end an argument, and it did. It told the world that air power wasn't finished. Evolving, that dominance belonged not to the side with the cleanest theories, but to the one willing to adapt faster than fear. And once that lesson was learned, it didn't disappear. It sank deep into doctrine, into memory, into the next war waiting over the horizon.